and the famous Causey hood.
Well, that was
how did that get developed?
That was an attempt to get the mosquitoes, to trap the mosquitoes that were causing the infection in the mice, so that in the morning when the field boys would go out, they would put a cover over the bottom of the hood and bring in the mice and the mosquitoes. Well, that only trapped the mosquitoes that were there at the time, and they might not be the same mosquitoes that had caused the infections. Later, Otis had a system where set with clocks. There would be one trap that would be closed at a certain hour, and the next hour there may be 6 traps along that would go off during the night. Then he would have the mosquitoes and the infections a little more closely associated. And later that was improved upon with these infections in the cages, in the little houses that you put up in the forest. After,
I was always impressed with the ingenuity that Otis and you showed. Did you ever? These cages were all manufactured right there in Belém?
Yes, we had an Indian. He was part Indian, part Brazilian, Portuguese descent, mostly Indian, I think. He was very clever. He worked with his toes and his hands, and he could make these. We could show him a picture, or we could be with him and tell him what we wanted, and he could work it out. So that.
And the clocks were purchased in the market?
And the clocks were purchased. We had to get around to find enough clocks to go. And then the wooden cages were used for traps rather than the metal cages that that you can buy, because the animals that were trapped didn't hurt themselves in struggling. They were dark, and there was no struggle of trying to escape, which was a bonus for us. When we were using the natural wild animals as sentinels eventually. We were trapping them, measuring and testing them, and then releasing them and getting them back.
You marked the animals?
They were marked, and then released to be recaptured at.
Now, what sort of animals were these that you found there?
These were the animals on the ground, principally, the rodents and marsupials. We had some, occasionally we could get, by mistake, we might get bats in them, but not very frequently.
Now, I remember one year, it must have been about 1961 or 1962, that Otis invented something that would catch the animals in the treetops.
Well, he did use traps in the treetops too. He'd set monkeys up as sentinels in the treetops, and then he was also catching the marsupials and the native monkeys.
I think I remember these were traps that were placed on a platform.
On a platform,
yeah.
yes.
And
yes.
on a pulley.
Yes, and you could let them down,
yeah,
and pull them up. They had to be fed, so that they always had to come down for their banana or whatever it was.
Well, this has turned out to be one of the most. The mammal recapture study in Belém has turned out to be one of the most productive projects that has ever been developed in the tropics.
Well,
you learned a lot about the virus cycle.
Learned so much about what we asked, and then the viruses there we could find that we found in the animals varied also with the mosquito population. These kerosene mosquitoes that were so common at the ground level with the monkeys. There'd be years, cycles, when they were scarce. Natural cycles, and the viruses that they transmitted also were not as frequently found.
How many viruses did you discover during the years in Belém?
Well, I never could keep up with the count. I think there were around, well, the kinds of viruses that we isolated were always, of course, more than the new ones. But there were a good proportion of new ones, something like 30, between 30 and 40, I guess.
And these were new
new,
science.
Completely new, yes.
So the $8,000 that the Rockefeller Foundation invested
well,
paid off?
it soon grew to more, but we never had any trouble about getting enough to carry on. But we didn't use money for the new things that other laboratories were investing in, because our problem there, we were dealing with a country, in a country where the resources for scientific work were not very abundant. And we didn't believe that it was right to buy these new lyophilization machines and things that had to, and ultracentrifuges that had to have expert care, because in the first place they couldn't be maintained, and they couldn't be replaced by or even bought by the laboratories that wanted to use them. So we, for instance, in our lyophilization, we used the jar of sulfuric acid, and made our own dry ice from carbon dioxide, imported the cylinders of carbon dioxide.
And a simple vacuum pump.
And a simple vacuum pump, yes. And then we had a means of freeze drying. But we had to use a kerosene refrigerator because there wasn't enough electricity to keep it going all the time.
How did you, in the early days, the electricity was off a good deal, wasn't it?
Yes, it was so low, the voltage, well, not only off, but the voltage so low that it couldn't maintain. We didn't have enough light in our lamps. We would get these, well, you could buy lamps with lower voltage and then get a better light. But still it wasn't enough. So we did a lot of work by candlelight, and we isolated our first yellow fever by candlelight.
Now, yellow fever came what year? You had an epidemic,
54. Right? That was the first year. Well, it was December, I think, November, December, 55. We had, that was when the Pirelli Rubber Company was establishing a rubber plantation. Everybody that exported rubber from Brazil had to plant rubber trees, and so that all the rubber companies, Goodyear and Pirelli and what were some of the others, anyway, they had places where they were establishing rubber plantations. And these plantations were built on, they used the root stock, and then they grafted the stem, and they grafted on that the tree for the leaves that keep them immune from the pests and parasites that...
And the workers got sick, did they?
Well, when they were clearing the forest, that was a sign to us, oh, now we're going to have yellow fever. We had dinner with the director of the operation, and he said that he was clearing. He'd started. I said, well, you're going to have some sick people, and I want to see them. He said, okay, I've already sent 3 people home today. I said, I'm coming tomorrow to see them. He said, no, wait till Saturday. No, I said, we have to see them tomorrow. We went out and bled these sick people, and they had the virus at the first bleeding.
Now, were these the same viruses that you had found in your sentinel monkeys?
No, this was yellow fever.
This was yellow fever.
This was yellow fever. Because the trees were being felled, and the hemogogus was coming to the ground. See, hemogogus doesn't come to the ground except, well, there might be clearings in a forest where when hemogogus could be caught at ground level, but mostly you would catch hemogogus up in the trees, up in the tree platforms. And others always had tree platforms to catch the mosquitoes that were around. But they did have these other viruses that we're getting from the monkeys too, but the first viruses we isolated from them, the sick ones that came, the first ones that we investigated did have yellow fever, and later we got more cases of yellow fever, and then we were interested in anybody that was sick for anything, and we would find they had more Oroboca or Martuba or something Murutuku, one of the, or the, as we called it then, BEE.
Yeah. And what other outbreaks or epidemics of disease did you investigate?
Well, up on the Guama River, there was a case where people were sick, and we went up and found, what was that virus that was Mayaro? It was also found in some other place in South America and had another name, or it was a...
You're thinking of the Yuruma virus.
The Yuruma virus, yes. No,
Bolivia.
In Bolivia. But Mayaro was this was the one we found up in this camp in the up on the Guama.
And I remember an outbreak of Oropouche virus.
That was
Can you tell us about that?
Shortly before we left. Oropouche. This was a case where one of our assistants said that there were several cases among his friends. People were sick. And when we went out to investigate, we found that to door, that there were a lot of people sick. And I remember that I don't remember that there were deaths, but there was a lot of illness. What we didn't find was the vector. We didn't pin that down. I think we were too late.